When a racist landlord cruelly evicts a black family on New Year's Eve, he thinks he's untouchable. But what happens next will shock everyone as karma delivers justice in the most unexpected way. Don't miss this powerful story of resilience and redemption. Like, share, and subscribe to support stories that inspire and empower. The chill of late December hung in the air as the Johnson family gathered in their modest living room, a small heater humming softly in the corner. The faint scent of cinnamon lingered from the batch of cookies Martha Johnson had baked earlier, a tradition she insisted on keeping, despite the family's financial struggles. "We may not have much, but we've got each other," Martha said with a warm smile, placing a plate of cookies on the table. Her husband, Charles, nodded in agreement as he strung the last set of lights around their tiny Christmas tree. "Next year will be better," he said, his voice steady with hope. "I can feel it." Their children, 12-year-old Jamie and 8-year-old Ella, sat cross-legged on the rug, giggling as they attempted to string popcorn for the tree. Despite their modest circumstances, the Johnsons radiated a quiet joy, their bond unshaken by the challenges they faced. For years, Charles had worked tirelessly at a nearby factory, picking up extra shifts to make ends meet. Martha contributed by running a small sewing business from home, crafting custom clothes for neighbors and friends. Together, they dreamed of saving enough money to eventually buy their own home, a place where they wouldn't have to answer to anyone. "This time next year, we'll be planning from a home that's ours," Charles said confidently as he joined his family by the tree. Jamie looked up, his face lighting up. "Does that mean we'll get a big yard?" he asked eagerly. Charles chuckled. "A yard big enough for you to run around in all day," he replied. Martha exchanged a glance with her husband, her eyes filled with quiet determination. Their dreams felt closer than ever, and New Year's Eve was the perfect time to embrace the promise of a brighter future. The sound of heavy boots on the porch interrupted the family's laughter. Charles exchanged a wary glance with Martha before rising to open the door. Standing outside was Mr. Alan Whitaker, the landlord. Dressed in a thick coat and a sharp hat, his presence exuded authority and entitlement. "Evening, Mr. Johnson," Whitaker said, his tone polite but cold. "Mind if I come in for a moment?" Charles stepped aside reluctantly, his gut tightening. Whitaker never visited without a reason, and it was rarely a good one. Once inside, Whitaker's gaze swept the modest home with barely concealed disdain. "I'll get straight to the point," he said, pulling a folded document from his coat pocket. "I'm terminating your lease. You have until midnight to vacate." Martha gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "What?" "But we've always paid on time." Charles took the paper, his eyes scanning the text as his hands trembled. "This doesn't make sense," he said, his voice strained. "We've done everything right." Whitaker shrugged, his expression indifferent. "I've decided to sell the property. Found a buyer willing to pay double. It's nothing personal, just business." "But it's New Year's Eve," Martha said, her voice breaking. "Where are we supposed to go?" Whitaker smirked. "That's not my problem. You've had a good run, but business is business." As Whitaker walked out, slamming the door behind him, the room fell into a heavy silence. Jamie and Ella looked to their parents, confusion and fear etched on their young faces. "Are we going to lose our home?" Jamie asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Charles knelt beside his son, gripping his shoulders gently. "We'll figure it out," he said, though his voice wavered. "We always do." Martha sat down on the couch, her head in her hands. Tears welled in her eyes as she thought about the memories they'd built in this house, the birthdays, the holidays, the late-night conversations around the table. "We can't let him get away with this," she said finally, her voice firm despite the tears streaming down her face. "We've done nothing wrong. He can't just throw us out like this." Charles nodded, his jaw tightening. "You're right. We're not going to roll over and let him take everything from us. Not this time." As the Johnsons began packing their belongings, the weight of their situation pressed down on them. The clock ticked closer to midnight, each passing second a cruel reminder of the landlord's heartlessness. Outside, neighbors peered through their curtains, some watching with quiet sympathy, while others avoided looking altogether. The Johnsons had always been well-liked, but few were willing to risk the wrath of Whitaker, who held influence over much of the town. As the family worked in silence, Charles paused for a moment, looking out the window at the frost-covered yard. His fists clenched at his sides. "He may think he's won," he muttered, "but this isn't over. Not by a long shot." With those words, the Johnsons resolved to fight back, even as the odds seemed stacked against them. The icy wind bit at their faces as the Johnson family carried box after box to their old, dented pickup truck parked in the driveway. Jamie shivered under his thin jacket, his small hands clutching a box of toys tightly. Beside him, Ella clung to her mother's side, her wide eyes filled with confusion. "Why do we have to leave?" Mama Ella asked, her voice trembling. "Did we do something bad?" Martha knelt beside her daughter, brushing a loose curl away from her face. "No, baby," she said softly, her voice cracking despite her effort to stay strong. "We didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes bad things happen, even when we don't deserve them." Charles, standing by the truck with a heavy box of tools, turned his head to hide the tears welling up in his eyes. He clenched his jaw, frustration and helplessness gnawing at him as he watched his children struggle to understand something even he couldn't fully explain. Inside the house, Martha moved quickly from room to room, grabbing essentials and trying to decide what they could fit into the truck. The eviction had come so suddenly, and with the cold weather worsening, she knew they had to act fast. "Take what we need most," she called to Charles, her voice steady despite the weight in her chest. "We can't carry everything." Charles nodded, grabbing bags of clothes and a few tools he knew he'd need to repair anything in the coming days. He glanced at the modest decorations on the walls, family photos, a small painting Jamie had made in school, and a cross passed down from Martha's grandmother. These weren't essentials, but leaving them behind felt like losing a part of themselves. "Martha," he said, holding the cross in his hand, "we're taking this. I don't care what else we have to leave behind." Martha looked over and gave him a tight nod, her throat too tight to speak. As they worked, the faint sound of curtains shifting broke the heavy silence. Charles turned to see neighbors peeking through their windows. Some watched with sympathy, their faces tense with discomfort. Others turned away as soon as he caught their eye, unwilling to confront the injustice happening before them. One neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Green, stepped cautiously onto her porch, wrapping her shawl tightly around her shoulders. "Charles," she called softly, her voice carrying through the cold air. Charles walked over, his breath visible in the freezing air. "Yes, ma'am. I'm so sorry this is happening," she said, wringing her hands. "If I could help, I would, but—" She trailed off, glancing toward Whitaker's house at the end of the street. Charles nodded, understanding the unspoken fear. "I know, Mrs. Green," he said. "Thank you for saying something. That means more than you know." As night fell, the family continued working under the dim light of the porch lamp. Jamie sat on the steps, holding Ella close as she drifted off to sleep in his arms. "Daddy, where are we going to sleep tonight?" he asked, his voice small and filled with worry. Charles paused, setting down a box of kitchen supplies. He crouched beside his son, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We'll find a place, Jamie. I promise. You just keep being strong for your sister, okay?" Jamie nodded, but his eyes betrayed the doubt he didn't want to voice. Inside, Martha sat at the kitchen table, staring at a list of shelters and motels she had hastily scribbled earlier. Most were already full for the night, and the few that weren't required money they didn't have. Her phone buzzed with a message from a friend who'd heard about their situation. "I'm so sorry, Martha. Wish I could help, but Whitaker owns too much in this town. Don't want to make him angry." Martha stared at the screen, tears spilling onto the paper. She wiped them away quickly when Charles entered the room. Just as their despair deepened, a knock came at the door. Charles opened it to find their neighbor, a younger man named Reggie, standing with his hands shoved into his coat pockets. "I heard what happened," Reggie said, glancing nervously toward the street. "Look, I can't do much, but I've got an old camper parked out back. You're welcome to use it until you figure something else out." Charles's shoulders sagged with relief. "Thank you, Reggie," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have no idea what this means to us." Reggie shrugged, his face tight with frustration. "It's not right, what Whitaker's doing. Somebody needs to stop him." "We will," Charles said firmly. "One way or another." As the family settled into the cramped but warm camper that night, Charles and Martha sat together, whispering so as not to wake the children. "We can't let him get away with this," Charles said, his hands gripping a steaming mug of coffee. "This isn't just about us. If we don't stand up to him, he'll keep doing this to other families." Martha nodded, her eyes burning with a mix of exhaustion and determination. "I'll start making calls tomorrow," she said. "There has to be someone out there who can help us." Charles placed a hand over hers. "We'll get through this, together." As the clock struck midnight, the faint sound of distant fireworks echoed through the night, marking the start of a new year. Despite their circumstances, the Johnsons clung to hope, vowing to fight for their home and their dignity. In a grand, dimly lit dining room at Whitaker's estate, a roaring fireplace cast flickering shadows on the walls adorned with portraits of ancestors. Alan Whitaker leaned back in his chair at the head of the table. A smug grin spread across his face as he swirled a glass of expensive bourbon. Around him sat a small group of friends and business associates, the air filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses. "Evicted them just in time," Whitaker boasted, his voice carrying over the room's chatter. "I told them they had until midnight, and they scurried off like rats. No complaints, no lawyers, nothing. It's almost too easy." His guests chuckled, raising their glasses in a mock toast. "To another clean sweep," Alan, one of them, said, smirking. "Ah, it's just business," Whitaker replied, feigning humility. "That land is worth more than what they were paying. I'm just clearing the way for better opportunities. If they couldn't handle it, well, that's their problem." Outside the mansion, the faint sound of fireworks crackling in the distance marked the arrival of the new year, but within those walls, Whitaker's words and laughter revealed a man confident in his untouchable position. Meanwhile, in the cramped camper Reggie had lent them, the Johnson family sat huddled together, going over what little they knew about their landlord's practices. Charles sat at the small table, a notebook in front of him, his pen tapping against the paper as he thought. "We can't just sit here and let him win," Charles said, his voice low but firm. Martha, sitting across from him, nodded. "I've been asking around. There's a woman named Angela, used to rent from Whitaker. She might know something that can help us." "Did she have to deal with this too?" Charles asked. "She did," Martha replied. "From what I hear, it wasn't just her. Whitaker's done this to a lot of people over the years." The next morning, Charles and Martha met Angela at a local coffee shop. She was a sharp, determined woman in her early 40s, her expression hardened by years of dealing with injustice. "You're not the first," Angela said, sipping her coffee. "Whitaker's been pulling these stunts for years, evicting tenants for no good reason, fabricating lease violations, and flipping properties for a quick profit. He thinks no one can touch him because he's got money and connections." Charles leaned forward, his fists clenched. "So why hasn't anyone stopped him?" Angela shrugged. "Most people are too scared or don't have the resources to fight back. But if we can prove he's been breaking the law, we might have a shot." With Angela's guidance, the Johnsons began gathering evidence. She connected them with a local housing advocate, Marcus Green, who specialized in tenant rights. Marcus brought a calm yet determined energy to the table, his years of experience evident in the meticulous way he approached the case. "I've dealt with people like Whitaker before," Marcus said during their first meeting. "They think they're untouchable because they've been getting away with this for so long. But everyone makes mistakes. We just need to find his." Together they pored over public records, uncovering a pattern of evictions and questionable property transactions. Angela shared her story, providing documents from her own eviction that mirrored the tactics Whitaker had used against the Johnsons. "This isn't just about us anymore," Martha said, her voice steady. "If he's been doing this to other families, we need to stop him." They discovered that Whitaker had consistently violated tenant laws, including falsifying lease violations, failing to provide adequate notice for evictions, and even misreporting property values to evade taxes. As the evidence piled up, the Johnsons began to feel a sense of hope they hadn't felt in days. Late one evening, as Charles reviewed documents by the dim light of a lamp, Jamie approached him with a folded piece of paper. "What's this?" Charles asked, unfolding it. "It's a drawing," Jamie said shyly. The picture showed their old house with the words "Home Again" scrawled in Jamie's uneven handwriting. Charles felt a lump in his throat as he looked at the drawing. He pulled Jamie close, ruffling his hair. "We're going to get it back," he promised. "I don't know how yet, but we will." Unbeknownst to Whitaker, whispers of the Johnsons' efforts were beginning to spread. One of his associates, a fellow landlord, brought it up during a casual conversation. "You might want to be careful," Alan, the man, said. "Word is that family you evicted is digging around. They've got some advocate helping them out." Whitaker waved him off with a laugh. "Let them dig. They won't find anything. People like that don't have the resources to take on someone like me." But as the days passed, small cracks began to appear in Whitaker's confidence. He noticed a local reporter making inquiries about his recent property transactions. A letter from a housing rights organization landed on his desk, requesting records of past evictions. "What is this nonsense?" Whitaker muttered, crumpling the letter. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. Back at the camper, Charles and Martha reviewed their plan with Angela and Marcus. The evidence they gathered was solid, but they needed to make sure it couldn't be ignored. "We'll take this to the press," Marcus said. "Public pressure can work wonders, especially when someone like Whitaker values his reputation." "And if that doesn't work?" Charles asked. "Then we take it to court," Angela replied. "He's broken enough laws to get him fined, if not worse." Charles looked at his wife, their hands clasped tightly. "We're not just fighting for ourselves anymore," he said. "We're fighting for everyone he's done this to." Martha nodded. "And we're not stopping until he's held accountable." It began with a single post on a local community forum, where Angela uploaded a detailed account of Whitaker's eviction tactics, complete with documentation and personal testimonies. "Alan Whitaker has been exploiting tenants for years, evicting families under false pretenses, violating housing laws, and profiting off their suffering. Here's proof." The post included scanned documents of falsified eviction notices, tax records showing discrepancies, and testimonials from several former tenants. Within hours, the story gained traction, with dozens of residents sharing their own experiences of mistreatment at Whitaker's hands. Marcus took the evidence to a local journalist, Hannah Reed, who had a reputation for tackling hard-hitting stories. "This isn't just about one family," Marcus explained. "This is a pattern of abuse that needs to be exposed." By the next morning, Hannah's article was published online with the headline, "Landlord's Dirty Secrets: Years of Exploitation Finally Uncovered." The article detailed Whitaker's history of discriminatory practices, tax evasion, and illegal evictions. It included quotes from Angela, Marcus, and even Charles and Martha, who spoke about the emotional toll of the eviction. The response was immediate. Social media exploded with outrage as locals shared the story, tagging housing advocacy groups and legal organizations. Some demanded justice, while others expressed guilt for staying silent for so long. "How could we let this happen in our town?" one post read. Another commented, "This man ruined families for profit. It's time he faces the consequences." Outside Whitaker's office, protesters gathered with signs that read "Justice for Tenants and End Exploitation." Local news crews arrived to cover the growing uproar, broadcasting interviews with affected families. Martha watched the news from the camper, tears welling in her eyes as she saw strangers standing up for them. "They're listening," she whispered, gripping Charles's hand. "People are finally listening." The growing public pressure forced the local government to act. Within days, housing authorities launched an official investigation into Whitaker's practices. Inspectors arrived at his properties, uncovering numerous violations, unsafe living conditions, unreported repairs, and fabricated lease terms. Meanwhile, the IRS opened a case against Whitaker for tax evasion, spurred by the discrepancies in his property filings. When a subpoena arrived at his office, Whitaker's usual arrogance gave way to visible unease. He paced his office, his face pale as he read the document. "What is this nonsense?" he barked at his assistant, tossing the paper onto his desk. "It's an investigation, sir," she said hesitantly. "They're requesting all your records." Whitaker slammed his fist on the desk. "This is a witch hunt. They have no idea who they're dealing with." But deep down, he knew the walls were closing in. The situation escalated when Marcus organized a press conference featuring several of Whitaker's former tenants. Standing before a crowd of reporters, Angela recounted her experience with clarity and strength. "He threw me out of my home with no warning," she said. "And I'm not the only one. He's done this to dozens of families, using his power and influence to silence us. But not anymore." Charles and Martha spoke next, their voices steady but emotional as they described the impact of the eviction on their family. "We've struggled, but we're still standing," Charles said, "and we're here to make sure no one else has to go through what we did." The press conference aired on multiple channels, further tarnishing Whitaker's reputation. By the end of the day, his name trended on social media with hashtags like Stop Whitaker and Tenant Justice. The breaking point came when authorities froze Whitaker's assets, pending the outcome of the investigation. For a man who thrived on wealth and influence, it was a devastating blow. Whitaker sat alone in his mansion, staring at the foreclosure notice on his desk. The once confident smirk was gone, replaced by a hollow look of defeat. His phone buzzed with calls from colleagues and investors, all distancing themselves from him to save their own reputations. At the same time, the Johnson family received news that their eviction had been reversed, thanks to the legal case brought against Whitaker. They were not only allowed to return to their home but were also awarded compensation for damages and emotional distress. When Charles shared the news with his family, cheers erupted in the camper. Jamie jumped into his father's arms and Ella clung to Martha, her face lighting up for the first time in weeks. "We did it," Charles said, his voice thick with emotion. "We really did it." Months later, Whitaker stood in court, facing a judge who outlined the charges against him: illegal evictions, discriminatory practices, and tax fraud. As he listened to the list of his crimes, Whitaker's mind raced, searching for a way out. But there was none. When the sentence was handed down, a hefty fine and community service, Whitaker felt the weight of his actions for the first time. His once pristine reputation was in ruins, and his life of luxury was over. Back at their home, the Johnson family gathered around the kitchen table for the first time since the ordeal began. The walls were decorated with Jamie's drawings, and the scent of Martha's cooking filled the air. Charles looked around the table, his heart swelling with pride. "We fought for this," he said, raising a glass of sweet tea. "And we won." "To new beginnings," Martha said, clinking her glass against his. As fireworks lit up the night sky, the Johnsons stepped onto their porch, looking out at the community that had rallied behind them. Their fight had brought justice not just for themselves but for countless others. "Happy New Year," Jamie said, grinning up at his parents. Charles wrapped an arm around his family, a sense of peace settling over him for the first time in months. The gavel struck the judge's desk, echoing through the courtroom. Alan Whitaker stood at the defendant's table, his once confident demeanor replaced with quiet defeat. The judge's words were clear and firm. "Mr. Whitaker, your actions have caused undue harm to countless families. This court sentences you to pay restitution to your victims and perform community service. Additionally, your properties will remain under investigation for further legal violations." As murmurs rippled through the room, Charles and Martha exchanged a glance, relief washing over them. Justice had finally been served. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, cameras flashing as the Johnson family stepped into the bright sunlight. Charles held Jamie's hand, and Martha carried Ella, their faces a mix of pride and quiet triumph. When asked for a comment, Charles spoke simply, "We didn't fight just for ourselves, we fought for everyone who's been wronged. And today justice won." The Johnsons returned to their home a week later, their hearts full of gratitude. The compensation awarded to them allowed for repairs and upgrades they could never have afforded before. Martha stood in the kitchen, humming softly as she unpacked boxes. The room now glowed with fresh paint, new appliances, and the comforting presence of family photos adorning the walls. Jamie and Ella ran through the house, their laughter echoing as they explored their newly refurbished bedrooms. Charles stepped onto the porch, taking in the sight of their land. The old fence had been mended, and the field stretched out in the golden light of a crisp New Year's morning. A new mailbox, donated by a neighbor, stood proudly at the edge of the driveway, bearing their name, the Johnson family. News of Whitaker's downfall had sent ripples through the small town. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak out now stood in solidarity with the Johnsons. Reggie, the young man who had lent the camper, arrived with his wife carrying a pot of stew. "Thought you could use a hot meal," he said, smiling. Mrs. Green, the elderly neighbor, brought a basket of baked goods, her hands trembling as she placed it on the counter. "You're an inspiration to all of us," she said, her voice thick with emotion. The Johnsons' yard soon filled with neighbors offering help, some fixing fences, others planting flowers, and many simply sharing stories. The once isolated family now stood at the heart of a united community. While the Johnsons rebuilt their lives, Whitaker's world continued to crumble. His face became a symbol of greed and corruption as news outlets covered his story extensively. Photographs of Whitaker in an orange vest, picking up trash on the roadside as part of his court-ordered community service, circulated widely. The man who had once lorded over others now stood as a stark reminder of what happens when power is abused. Local businesses distanced themselves from him, and his properties were placed under new management to ensure ethical practices moving forward. As evening fell on New Year's Day, the Johnsons gathered around a bonfire in their backyard. Friends and neighbors joined them, the warmth of the flames mirrored by the unity among the group. Charles stood with Martha by his side, holding a mug of steaming cider. He looked out at the people who had supported them and those they had inspired. "This year didn't start the way we planned," Charles began, his voice steady but emotional. "But it showed us what's possible when we stand together. We're stronger than any challenge, and we're proof that no one has to fight alone." Martha squeezed his hand, her smile radiant. "And we're grateful to every single one of you for reminding us that community isn't just about living next to each other. It's about standing up for what's right." Jamie and Ella sat with the other children, roasting marshmallows and laughing as the first fireworks of the night lit up the sky. The family's journey had come full circle, from despair to hope, from isolation to unity. As the final embers of the bonfire glowed, Charles sat quietly with Jamie beside him. The boy leaned his head against his father's shoulder. "Dad," Jamie said, His voice soft. Why did all of this happen? Charles took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Sometimes, people think having power means they can hurt others and get away with it, he said. But what matters is how we respond. We stood up, we didn't give up, and we showed that even when things seem impossible, we can make them right. Jamie nodded, his small hand gripping his father's arm. So we can make the world better. Charles smiled. That's exactly right, son. And it starts with moments like this. As the story concludes, the Johnsons are not just survivors, they are symbols of resilience, justice, and the power of unity. Their victory reminds us all that standing up to injustice is not just an act of courage, but a step toward building a world where fairness and compassion prevail.